Good morning, everyone. We want to welcome you to the Georgia SEAL Part 2, COVID-19 Ambassador Training. Georgia SEAL is a community engaged alliance against COVID-19 disparities, and we partner with community organizations to host events to decrease the spread of COVID-19 and build confidence in the vaccine, and also increase uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine. And we are grateful to the Black Cross for partnering with us on this training. Gail?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, wasn't sure. I'm always having technical difficulties. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Good to be here. I'm Gail Brooks. I'm the founder and principal strategist of the Black Cross. And the Black Cross leverages cultural engagement and storytelling techniques to advance health equity in socially vulnerable communities of color. As we all know, these communities are extremely diverse, so we focus on getting the right information into the hands of as many peer ambassadors, community health workers, and trusted messengers like yourselves as possible. Please meet my colleague, LaTroya Hester.
Hi, everyone. I'm LaTroya Hester, and I am so excited to be a part of today's training. As we jump in, I just wanted to go over some of the objectives for today. So today we're really excited to learn and understand the role of identity, culture, and storytelling. That's going to be core to what we're talking about today. We're going to discuss the 4 truths of storytelling, and we're going to learn how the counter-narrative messaging is really a perfect strategy for helping folks to overcome barriers when it comes to COVID-19 vaccination. We're going to talk to you about how to implement those strategies. Then we're going to learn best practices for creating storytelling content of your own, especially through the use of course, social media.
Great. So some of you may be asking yourselves, why storytelling? Why so much talk about storytelling as it relates to health equity these days? Well, storytelling has long been used to address issues in society that can be controversial or just difficult to discuss. People like yourselves tell story to inform audiences of past and present social conditions, as well as the structural forces that work to create these conditions, right? Stories help us to reimagine new possibilities for these conditions, or perhaps shift the popular narrative further toward one of justice and empowerment. We also foster agency by elevating marginalized voices via stories, right? So people giving their testimonies in terms of what's really happening in their communities comes to mind. Survivor stories or patient diaries documenting their experiences with certain illnesses. But stories can also inspire people to take other types of actions. In this instance, we're looking to inspire parents and caregivers to vaccinate themselves and or their children, and to perhaps call for policy decisions that improve their access to equitable care. But we'll talk more about the second one at another time. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you. All right. So for the next hour, I'd like you to think of yourselves as documentarians and journalists. As such, we need facts. We need facts that are told in a way that create an emotional as well as a cultural connection. Creating storytelling content that inspires healthy change is both a creative and an evidence-based process. That process requires rigorous discovery in 4 key areas. The good news is that we've done that discovery for you. So first, what, right? Every good story needs to bring the listener along on a journey. For that, we need a clear mission and one that motivates the listener. We next need to consider who the audience really is. No cultural group is a monolith, and we can't just look at the census stats. We need to understand what moves them, who are they connected to, what gets them out of bed at night, and also what keeps them up. What are the critical milestones along the journey in this story, and how can we meet those unique needs that they have at each milestone? We need to understand how to tell the story, right? So the evidence is in the story. We have to wrap that in a bunch of other stuff. And there's a method to that madness. We call that the 4 truths of storytelling. It's how we can frame that journey in a way that makes the audience want to join. So we'll talk about the 4 truths of storytelling, and we'll also talk about the counter-narrative approach to message development. Sounds really technical, but really concepts that are simple to understand and anyone can employ. And finally, we have to know where to tell the story and when to tell the story, because at the end of the day, context is king for every story. Next slide, please. Okay, first, let's level set on culture, right? Before we move to the next slide, let's go back really quick. Please drop, if anyone can drop into the chat, a short description of their definition of culture. We gave you a little peek under the tent. Don't be shy. Does anyone have an idea on how we might define culture? No? Okay. No problem. Not to put any, oh, thank you, Miss Mary Williams Stover. Yes, language, style, speech. Good to see you here. Language, style, speech, the way that we do things. Absolutely. Next slide, please. But when we think of culture, we don't just think of the culture itself. We have to think of the influence culture has and the equity that someone might have within a particular community, right? We need to understand how they're able to actually impact the culture of another group, or how a group is able to impact the culture of yet another group. We also have to think about the cultural lens, and that's a product of one's socio-cultural context, as I said, which is king. It is the past, the present, and the hopeful future, right, around social conditions or the environment in which we live or that group lives. It's the unique way that a person or cultural group sees the world. I can put the same message out and have it be received very differently by different cultural groups. Next slide. Now, culture, or cultural influence rather, operates on multiple levels of society, right? And they all impact how we see ourselves, how we see each other, how we see the stories that we tell each other. From a pop culture standpoint, culture is at the general population level. That's baseball, Beyonce, burritos. Pretty easy, right? Things are accessible to everyone. Pop culture typically seeks to unite the whole. Origin culture creates distinctions between groups, not necessarily negative distinctions, but differences nonetheless that we must account for. It's driven by the circumstances and conditions in which someone is born. So demographics defined by race, gender, ethnicity, religion, geography, those things have a significant impact on who we are as a person, our identity, our worldview, our self-concept. But oops, sorry about that. Lost my place here. Jumping to the next slide without you guys. Give me 1 second. Okay. So beyond demographics, though, we have to think about subcultures and tribes. Those are typically driven by passion points, interests, ideologies. This is where we most meaningfully connect with a person, but they can be also the most difficult levels of culture to penetrate when it comes to connecting up to a person. So oftentimes we might need that trusted messenger to actually get us into the conversation, right? Examples of subcultures or tribes in the United States could be liberalism versus conservatism. Baddies, Barbies, and Fresas, if you're a young teen or young adult woman, might ring a bell for you. Fresas being Hispanic, baddies and Barbies, African American. And because these subcultures are highly nuanced, we have to do an extra level of profiling. So let's get to work. Now, again, you asked, why storytelling? You still haven't quite told me that. So I'll give a little bit of background as to why we rely so heavily on storytelling. Stories, or also called narratives, have been used for thousands of years to entertain, educate, empower, and influence. So much so that our human brains are wired to learn through stories and predisposed to listen to storytellers. When a person listens to a story, the brain actually responds as if it were experiencing it firsthand. In indigenous communities or tribes, people gathered around the fire or the ring shout, depending upon where you were. And it was the griot, the shaman, the medicine woman, the artist that recorded the oral histories of these tribes. That encoded the beliefs, the values, the practices, the cultural markers or symbols that we use to self-identify into the fabric of tribal identity. In West Africa, griots, or storytellers, singers, and soothsayers, were trusted advisors or trusted messengers to nobility. They also kept the records of births, deaths, marriages, and cultural traditions. So kind of a broad range of responsibility they had in Native cultures. Next slide. Now today, storytelling is used for similar purposes, but unfortunately, it's used to drive healthy and unhealthy change. There are three types of stories that we consider when we're looking to drive or enact change in our communities. We're concerned with political or social narratives, right? Those are used to promote an ideology, a worldview, sometimes to defend a position, such as why I don't get vaccinated. They're used to help mobilize people around an issue or even co-opt a cause. So some may be aware that, there's been an anti-vaccination movement in this country for quite a long time. Along came COVID-19 and there's fuel for the fire to help that movement grow. Community narratives, as I mentioned, they document the truth of a community's past, present, and reimagined future. And then the personal narratives that I mentioned or referred to, such as survivor stories or patient diaries. While these outcomes and agendas may vary or differ between this, depending upon who the storyteller is, the principles of effective storytelling remain the same. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. Let's get to work. Okay, so our mission and our audience. Our mission very clearly is to drive vaccine confidence and uptake among gatekeeping women and moms, as well as parents and caregivers. Those are two separate personas or profiles that we've created and will provide to you after the training. Gatekeeping women and moms tend to be a little bit younger, 18 to 44. Parents and caregivers, because it's a broader range and it can include non-traditional families, such as the elderly or grandparents who are in the role of a primary caregiver. We use 25 to 64 for that range. Next slide. All right, so I mentioned the 4 truths of storytelling. Now, this is an approach that we used in commercial advertising and marketing. It was pioneered by Hollywood director Peter Guber, not the principles, just really the name. Next slide. And it gives us 4 areas of that discovery that I mentioned that we really have to drill down into in order to get to the emotional needs that we connect to and to the cultural resonance that we rely on to make that message matter, right? It also helps us to tie all of that together into one key storytelling platform. Next slide. Truth of the teller. So we have to ask ourselves first, the hard question. Sometimes it's a little uncomfortable. Am I really authentic to this audience and to this mission? So let's assume that you are authentic to the mission, but are you authentic to the audience, right? Are you culturally congruent? If you're not congruent, in other words, kind of the same culture, are you at least competent in that culture? Do you at least understand or know what resonates most with your audience? Are your values aligned with the beliefs and the values of your audience? And how do those values, the ones that they have of you or that they perceive you to have, align with the mission? All of that stuff we have to think about because that's what drives credibility and authenticity. Do I have cultural equity? Meaning, is this my first rodeo or do I have a long-standing tradition of helping to drive healthy change in this community? If you've been in the community for a while, working on different types of causes and helping to drive healthy change, well, you have cultural equity and can enter a conversation on a new topic that engages fears a lot more easily than if you're showing up on the first day of school. All right, next slide. Let's look at the truth of the audience. Okay, so audience profiling, as we call it, is a community-based participatory research process. We use social listening, we use community listening sessions, we use surveys, we conduct in-depth interviews. There's a whole bevy of resources and tools that we use to profile the whole person, right? For our vaccine projects, we looked at self-concept, cultural origins. We mapped their social network to understand who they influence as well as who influences them. We look at their passion points to really kind of see what gets them up in the morning, what keeps them up at night. And then we look at the level of cultural engagement. So what do we mean by the level of cultural engagement? Well, not everyone is just Hispanic, right? Third generation Latinos may not engage in traditional culture to the same degree as, let's say, the first generation, right? This may even vary from house to house, though I have the same generations within the house. We call that acculturation, right? The degree to which they have assimilated, or rather acculturated, into American culture. We look at, and I actually, in this instance, I want to use an example. Meet Naima. That's the young lady who's in the upper right corner of this slide. Naima identifies as Muslim, right? And we can kind of see that based, maybe, if we know, based on her head wrap. But to be specific, she's not just Muslim, she's Muslim cool. And that term was coined from a book of the same name that actually explores the connection between race, Islam, and hip hop in America. So we know she's Muslim, right? We also might suspect that she's into hip hop culture by the door knocker earrings that she has displayed prominently in the photograph as well. We look at who she follows on social media and who she listens to on Spotify to know that Mumu Fresh, who's another Muslim hip hop artist, and The Roots are her top two favorites. These are all cultural markers that we can use to kind of establish rapport with our audience or create content that just resonates and breaks through the clutter of all of the other content that comes through that timeline. Finally, we think about cultural spaces. These are places where culture is action. Culture is in action. And sometimes they're closed spaces, and you do need a trusted messenger or an ambassador to help you gain entry into those spaces and then into that conversation. For Afghan refugees, right, I might engage community imams to start. For Muslim cools, I might map their social network, as I mentioned, and identify potential ambassadors who are credible in the context of health and healthcare, right? Might not be a female basket player in this instance. What we do know is that she's a hip hop head, and so she listens to Sway's Universe on Sirius Radio. And we know that Sway has had Riza Islam, one of the COVID disinformation dirty dozen, on his show to talk about the pandemic or COVID in general and vaccination. He's fueled a lot of doubt and distrust in the vaccine. So it's important to kind of understand where she might be starting from in terms of her beliefs or perspectives around COVID vaccination. Next slide. Now, when we dig into those doubts, we find that they all ladder up to kind of three key areas. That's doubt or distrust in institutions, such as the government, the pharma industrial complex, as some call it. That's doubt and distrust in the science. So there's a lot of suspicion still around the development process. How did they get it into the marketplace so quickly? Which actually, when you start looking at that, runs counter to this idea that big pharma and government were in collusion to make money. When you start to look at the actual amount of money that government spent to expedite this vaccine development process. And then finally, there's doubt due to the lack of information or information mayhem. It may be that my child has an underlying condition and I haven't seen any information that tells me whether it's safe for her to get vaccinated. Or it could be that I've seen so much information and too much of it is conflicting that I don't know who or what to believe. Next slide. Okay, so mentioned the social listening process. I'm not going to go too deep into that. Happy to supply more information at another time or even have a conversation around how we do that. But when we did social listening, we were able to map 10 key narratives. This was not just social listening. This was in combination with a ton of data, some of which was provided by Morehouse School of Medicine and a number of other academic institutions and community listening sessions. We found that these 10 narratives rose to the top, right? It's about freedom from government control, freedom, which is typically driven by conspiracy theories. But there was also another narrative that's going around related to freedom, and that was medical freedom or freedom, religious freedom. The term body autonomy came up quite a bit, particularly among younger audiences. COVID vaccines don't work. What's the point? Well, if I can still catch COVID and I'm vaccinated, that means it must work. Well, we don't all know, but we know that that is an oversimplified logic that we want to help you to create messaging around to address. right? So these are those top 10, and they're listed from highest to lowest degree in vax hesitancy. Next slide. Or actually, before we go to the next slide, I think it might be a good opportunity for us to get a little bit more input from the audience. I want you to take a look at these 10 that are on the screen and think about the conversations that you've had in your community around COVID vax hesitancy, or just conversations that you've had with the target in question, right? Parents and caregivers. Out of these 10, we're going to ask you to select the top 3. Okay, what are the top 3 that you've heard most in these conversations?
Can everybody see the poll that just popped up? Wanted to make sure. No? Gail, can you see the poll?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, great.
And let us know if you have any questions about these narratives as they're listed. A number of them to go through, so we'll give you a little bit more time to read through them. Okay. Anybody need more time? Just drop anything into the chat, more time. Maybe drop more time in the chat. Otherwise, we'll move on after we take a look at the results. Okay. So it looks like everyone's had a chance to select their top 3. Okay. Wayne, were you able to include that in the poll itself? If not, we'll just account for your response on the back end. Okay, so it looks like we have a winner. It's about freedom from, interesting, it's about freedom from government control, which is largely driven by conspiracy. Great, okay, the big push, not so much. It looks like the next, oh wow, okay, and then it looks like next one is, it's not worth the risk. Yep. Side effects. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Let's go to the next slide and see what the data said as far as what we had access to in terms of what was most prevalent among parents and caregivers specific to their concerns as parents and caregivers. So I want to be clear about that. It may not be just the general kind of hesitancy that people have. It's really specific to things that are unique, right, to that persona or that person. Next slide. Over there. Okay. So you can see how the order changed, right? So at the top, the one that was number 1 in terms of prevalence amongst this group is actually number 6 when we look at the general market, right? One that was number 2 was actually number 10. Now we're going to have more accurate data once we get that survey back from Morehouse and Seal, but this is what we were able to put together as far as third-party data related to parents and caregivers specifically. Now, we do have information also on gatekeeping women and moms that we include as a separate profile. But wanted to do this exercise to show you just how much nuance there is when we start to drill down from general public into these more nuanced subcultures and tribes. Next slide, please. Okay, so truth of the moment and truth of the mission. The meat, as we might say. All right. So every storyteller and rabble rouser, including myself, not at all comparing myself to MLK or Cesar Chavez, have had to ask themselves, for my audience, is my mission soul stirring, right? Does it connect emotionally? Does it resonate culturally? Or is it somehow in conflict with those beliefs and perceptions, such as the hesitancy narratives that we saw or that we just went through earlier? Well, the good news is that within these narratives, there tend to be an Achilles heels, right? Those are weak spots in logic or evidence that really help us to overcome those perceptions with evidence or facts. Now, it may not happen overnight, which is why we call it a journey to vaccine confidence and uptake, but through repeated conversations and addressing kind of specific needs or questions as they arise, we are able to move people along on this journey. Okay, so more on Achilles' heels in a bit. Next slide. Truth of the moment. So that's the cultural or social or historical context that's going to impact the way that I think about vaccine uptake and confidence, right? So we have to remember that the truth of the moment includes the past and the present. So it's undeniable that the racial unrest that occurred surrounding the first year of the pandemic had an influence on how people of color looked at vaccination. It did fuel fires of distrust and doubt, and it did fuel hesitancy as it related to getting vaccinated. And then when we look in the past, there's quite a legacy, right? Unfortunately, that we might need to kind of peel back the layers of an onion in order to get to the root driver of this hesitancy. When we're thinking about African-American audiences, we know that they were subjected to abuse, they were subjected to experimentation, they were subjected to bias and exclusion from access to medical care for years, not just in slavery, but up until recently. They were profiled as, let's say, maybe being more tolerant of pain or seeking drugs when in fact they were actually under severe pain. The picture of the Black woman that you see on the slide is a real COVID patient who died in the hospital, who broadcast from the hospital on her cell phone the experience she was having, right? Being denied care or being denied the drugs that she, being a doctor herself, knew that she needed in order to help treat her condition. Hispanic audience have also been subjected to this abuse. We know that forced sterilization was an issue for Hispanic audiences up until even 1970s, right? So all of these are things that we need to acknowledge and bring into the conversation as we're talking about vaccine confidence and uptake. Next slide. All right, so now let's get into kind of making the messages, the sausage making, as we might say. For this, we look at the counter-narrative approach, which is the truth that targets the heel. Now, in order to develop these counter-narratives, we now need our platform, right? Because all these different messages need to fall under a specific kind of theme, right? So thinking about what we've discussed, the truth of the teller, we know they need to be culturally competent, they need to be providers and or community advocates, people with equity in the communities that they're looking to serve, right? As far as the truth of the audience goes, we know they're doubtful of the vaccine's safety, its efficacy, and they're distrustful of the healthcare system and culturally incongruent providers. So did I pass the check, the sniff check, as you might say, as it relates to authenticity? Truth of the moment. Well, given the long-standing history of bias, abuse, neglect by the healthcare system in African-American and Hispanic American communities, parent and caregiver doubts are in fact reasonable. To the outside person who's not considering this concept, they might seem a little far-fetched, but when we look at it in totality, it's quite reasonable for these people to have these doubts, right? And then finally, the truth of the mission. That's what we really want to accomplish in the end of the day. Well, that's driving confidence and uptake. So where we landed as far as this big idea platform was reasonable doubts. We like the equity that it ties back to in terms of the truth of the teller, the audience, the moments, and the mission. And we also like the cultural resonance that it has when it ties back to none other than Jigga. All right, next slide. Or Jay-Z, or your preferred moniker for our favorite rapper. Okay, so counter-narrative approach. Let me dig into that. These are strategies for developing that messaging, and there are 5 key things that each counter-narrative strategy requires. We've got to acknowledge the moment, so we'll give you information, specifics that you can include in your conversations or your content that acknowledge the past, but then also give evidence about how that past has been accounted for and how we put protections in place so that that past doesn't come into the present or into the future. We have to ID a clear target. Who am I really talking to? I won't be able to resonate unless I know that. We need to understand the heel of the story, that they're giving us. Now, people don't necessarily talk in narratives, right? They give us specific barriers. So we'll give you tools that'll help you to map those specific reasons that they give you with this overarching theme that we've developed these strategies for. The counter-narrative strategies also have to present facts and evidence, right? And they've got to meaningfully connect through those cultural markers that we said, right? So that can include in colloquial language, imagery, cultural influencers like Jay-Z, Beyonce, or the language of our cultural influencers. A hook. Every good story, every good message, every good presentation has a hook. Or an opener, right? Things that will kind of get us into the moment, pull us into what this person has to say, make us want to walk the walk along this journey, right? It grabs the audience's attention, super important in conversations, but also in social media based on what we know about, let's say, how the algorithm works. And then there are literary devices as well. So sometimes we'll use paradox to kind of show the logic, where the logic starts to break down, or we'll use humor to reel the audience in and maybe lighten a topic that could be a little more heavy. And then finally, credible storytellers, right? Trust is everything. Next slide. Now on this last slide, I'm sorry, it's a little bit small. I'm hoping people can actually see it. I just wanted to show you how these narratives and counter narratives are actually coming to play in social media, right? It's a never-ending dance, which means that we have work to do and that we need to get this information into the hands of as many people as possible. So on the left-hand side is the common anti-vax narrative, right? They're not safe. It's the one that came up, I think, as the second one, the second most mentioned one by our audience today. Well, that's the anti-vax narrative. They're not safe. So the pro-vaxxers come back, right? People like us, and they say, well, there's no evidence to say that it's not safe. Our data, right, our heavily monitored data that was gained with the oversight of your trusted advisors, tells us A, B, and C, right? Well, then the anti-vaxxers come back with the narrative, you got to do your own research. Well, we know that that's harder, not as easy to do as it might sound, based on things such as algorithms and filter bubbles. And if all of that is not making as much sense as you think it should to you, you can go back and watch part 1 of the training, where we go into depth of exactly what the filter bubble is and how it makes it super hard for people, common lay people, to do their own research and not just find things that they're already seeing or believing, right? Then the one on the right, excuse me, starts with the pro-vax narrative. Vaccine mandates are for the public's protection. Well, then anti-vaxxers come back, no, it's about my freedom, right? Or they might say to you, I don't need your protection. God got me, right? They have my back. So we've worked with faith leaders to help them understand ways of how we reconcile both faith and science in conversations such as this. Okay, next slide. And I think it's time for me to pass the baton over to LaTroya, who'll take you through the actual implementation of all of this insight and strategy.
It is. So thank you so much, Gail. Okay, so this is the point where we talk about the when and the where in our storytelling process. If you haven't been taking notes up to this point, which I hope that you have, now is the time to break out your pen and your paper, because what we want to do is allow you the opportunity to do some practical application, see how this all works in real life execution so that you can be prepared to create messages and execute them through social media as well. So we're going to be talking about strategic message planning and development. I want to give you a little bit of a framework so that you can kind of think about how we position the counter narrative strategy in the work that we're all doing. I'm going to basically summarize what Gail has already said, but again, our approach is really to target current narrative fallacies or areas where people've got the story a little bit off, and we're going to use a counter narrative as our approach to attacking that sort of area of misbelief. So we start with our general message. This is the priority message that we want to get out to our audiences. This is the place where we're going to give them factual information about COVID-19. We already have an idea of what topics we want to share. That's our general message. But then we're going to filter it through our cultural strategy. This is going to be our approach to getting them to receive our information. And the strategy that we're using is the counter narrative approach that centers on storytelling. So Gail's already set us up. We already have the understanding that we can't message our audience unless we know who they are, what they believe, what their struggles are. These are all based on cultural insights. And so we take our general message, we filter it through our cultural strategy, and what we end up with is a strategic message. We want to make sure that everything you put out in social or wherever it ends up, whether it be in a magazine or whatever channel, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we want to make sure that those messages are strategic, they're intentional, they're on purpose, and they're created with the audience in mind, right? So once we filter our general message through a cultural strategy, we end up with a culturally tailored message that directly addresses prevalent false narratives, because again, this is all centered on the counter narrative approach. So make sure you capture these little bubbles in your notes, and I'll keep it moving. All right, so I'm really excited that you guys are going to get in very great detail a toolkit that outlines many of the barriers and the areas of disbelief or misbelief that we've been talking about. But I want to point out what the content is going to look like when you receive it. And so in your toolkit, there's going to be a key where you see in this top line, so that number 6 that popped up in our rankings of areas of our, of barriers, you'll see it says it's not worth the risk, right? So that is that barrier. And in this case, this person is probably open, but just not aware of the science. There are other people that may have the belief that it's not worth the risk, but they're really science averse. And so we attack that. Well, I shouldn't say attack, but we approach that differently, right? But in your key, you're going to get real specific, detailed information about how to respond and which counter narrative strategy you're actually going to use. And we're going to look. So we know that it's not worth the risk. It's probably based on the idea that they're concerned about side effects. So that's the category. I'm going to show you real quick. I'm just going to toggle between slides. In your toolkit, you're going to get a very detailed list of potential side effects. You can't see it so clearly here. I just want you to understand how robust the information is that you're going to receive. So let's go back to our example here. You can see that the category is side effects. And if they are particularly concerned with something like myocarditis, right? That's the barrier that's going to be kind of central to the argument. We're also going to give you a belief statement that they're probably thinking about when they're thinking through those barriers. So again, as Gail said, people may not always offer you a specific narrative when they're explaining what their hesitancy is, but they will tell you that there's this barrier, okay? They may say something like, the COVID-19 vaccine is causing myocarditis in young people, and so it's just not safe for my teenager. What they may not understand, of course, is that this is a very rare situation and usually very temporary. But we know what their belief statement starts at, and so we know that we're going to approach them with a counter-narrative strategy that's based on what we call calculated risk. We help them understand, okay, have you calculated that risk and compared it to the actual risk of getting COVID-19? Or we use the side time approach, which really just gives them the science to address that area of disbelief or misbelief. And then the great thing that's going to show up in your toolkit as well is a whole explanation so that you get that general message, those topics, those facts that we talked about, those are going to be laid out for you. And so the toolkit's going to be extremely valuable. And what I want to do in the next couple of slides is help you to think about how you're going to be applying the toolkit to the work that you're doing. We're going to look at tons of examples. All right, but let's get into the good stuff. So once you understand your audience, you understand the approach that you're going to take, and you actually get down to sit down and create your messages where you're like, okay, I'm going to get my social media posts together, right? I want you to prepare your content for real world execution by considering an engagement strategy or a hook. Gail already mentioned that. Let's dig in a little bit further about what that could look like. Your hook can be something like a fact or a statistic or some sort of a literary device like a paradox, an analogy, things that make sense, especially when you have the privilege and the opportunity to use in-group language. On the screen, Gail shared with me yesterday this fabulous post. It's by Raven. If you see it here, it says Black storytelling literary devices are my favorite. And so she tells you how the stories usually go, right? You have your introduction, your climax, and your resolution. But in my community, in the Black community, sometimes we may start the story with something like, so tell me why, right? This is when you know a story is coming, because that is just very culturally specific. When we start a a story that way. And then we know that the twist comes when someone says, come to find out, right? So when the person says, come to find out, this is just the way we tell a story. And for me, when I have rested my case, when I have wrapped up my argument, I tend to say, I said what I said, right? So these are all the kinds of ways that we can speak, and you can infuse that into your post, into your strategic messaging as an engagement strategy. I want you to get in the habit of looking for these things when you are creating your post. You can also use a trusted tactic, so you know something is genuine when someone's like recording in their car. If it's not overproduced, you can feel that it's more trustworthy because it wasn't this production that seemed like it's trying to drive you toward a decision. And you can also attach those messages to something that's really familiar. So I know during the pandemic, and maybe many of you, we spent a lot of time online. And if you guys watched Versus, you probably saw Fat Joe versus Ja Rule, right? I saw Brandy versus Monica on there. I think Kirk Franklin versus whoever, right? So it became a very common thing that we saw during the pandemic. You can take something that's common, that's really approachable and non-threatening, and you can reposition the content that you want to share, that general message, and you can put it right there in that same context. This would be an engagement strategy. So if you look at the screen here in the green, we have traffic fatalities versus COVID-19 deaths. So we're really positioning that heavy scientific data, right? But we're putting it in a way that's really non-threatening. Now, the other cool thing about your toolkit is that it's going to include a key that gives you potential engagement strategies depending on the specific narrative you're trying to attack, or I should say, address. All right, so then you have your hook.
It's cool. It's cool, LaToya. We combat COVID over in these parts with the truth. You're good.
That's true. So an engagement strategy that you definitely want to go ahead and plan to employ is an opener, right? So this is any way that you can use to sort of prime your audience, to soften them up so that they'll be more receptive to vaccine information. In this particular example, you'll see that this is actually a social media carousel. These you may be familiar with Instagram carousels, right? So you'd have to swipe through them, but it starts with an opener. What did you bring home from the cookout, right? More than just mac and cheese and a to-go and ribs in that to-go plate. So this is presenting an idea in a very approachable, non-threatening way that, yeah, you know, I was at that cookout. I might have brought a little something extra home. And when you swipe over, you see that the content is really about the statistics based on not social distancing and how hospitalizations are really on the rise. And so this is a way to really get at the heel of some mis and disinformation and really to help people to like call into question some of that knowledge that they think that they had. Remember when we talked earlier, did you do your own research? You said, you know, go do your own research, but did you pop that filter bubble? And so you start with something that's really common, and then you use that to introduce some heavier information. All right, so this one is my favorite. This is a cultural marker. Now, the importance of a cultural marker really rests in your ability to associate yourself with the audience that you're talking to. Not to say that you are going to be keen on every single subculture and every tribe that there is, but whether these cues are visual or audio, they really do indicate that you're associated, that you get it, that you can express a level of empathy, that you have some street cred, or what it may be also known as cultural credibility, or even just traditional credibility, to say, listen, I have the authority to say what I'm about to say, and I am of you, I am from you, I am of the people, for the people, right? And so when we use cultural markers, what we're really saying is, you can listen to me because I'm from where you're from. And my favorite example here, you can see this on the Vax Facts post, where if you were from Atlanta, you already know, right? Like, this is Grady Hospital. How many Grady babies are in the room right now? Like, you already know. And if you look at the image, you know it's Grady. You remember the headlines about the fact that hospitals were really being inundated with so many people they couldn't hold them. And this is because of low levels of vaccination at that time, right? And so even just the language, we full, right? Drop the B verb, because that's how we talk when we're from Atlanta. We're not going to say, yes, we're inundated. No, we full Grady, right? That's the way this is communicated. And it only makes sense to you if you are a part of that culture, right? And so these cultural markers are extremely important to include in all of your posts. So you've got your engagement strategy, right? You've got your opener, but you always want to make sure that you include a cultural marker. And let me just point out, that a trusted messenger can also be the cultural marker. And we'll look at some examples there too. I also wanted to include this fun one. As a parent of a kindergartner, Bluey, in fact, just, I don't know, those of you who are parents, you probably know Bluey, and you probably know that Bluey's parents are hashtag parent goals, right? And so even if you're creating content, posters and things that are pointing back to something that's very much a part of the in-group experience, that is an example of a cultural marker. So here, instead of saying wash your hands for 20 seconds and sing the happy birthday song, it's the poor little bug on the wall, ding, ding. And if you're familiar with this subculture of parenthood, right, this is gonna resonate with you. So anything can be a cultural marker when it makes sense to that particular subgroup. Now, before I wrap, I want to make sure that you guys remember that we have to be very mindful of our channel and our calls to action. They need to be very specific to our audiences. Your channel needs to be culturally relevant, right? So if you are trying to reach 17-year-olds, you need to be on TikTok, right? And if you are reaching a different demographic, when it comes to social, you cannot forget about Facebook. But it may also be necessary for you to place ads in specific, or not place ads, but place your messages in specific outlets such as podcasts where you know your folks are, or even in a magazine that's very specific to the demographic or the subculture that you're trying to reach. I also want to point out that your channel has to reflect the whereabouts of your audience. So if they don't hang out on Instagram, you just have to tell yourself, as much as you love Instagram, your audience is someplace else, okay? Now, when it comes to the call to action, again, I want you to be mindful of your audience. So your calls to action, or because this is, well, first of all, when it comes to COVID-19, this is life and death. So we are trying to get people to move from awareness to action, and we cannot be willy-nilly about our calls to action. So we want to make sure that they're aligned with any audience outcomes. So if there's anything that you have to measure, then you definitely want that to be a part of your call to action. You also want it to be appropriate for where your audience is in their journey. That means that if they're just getting to understand an issue, the most you can really ask for them is for them to get involved or to learn more, right? But once they've moved on a little further, we kind of don't got time for this. We need you to go ahead and get vaccinated. That is the call to action. Now, I also wanted to point out that sometimes your call to action can be a cultural marker in and of itself and can also reflect the channel where it appears. So if you see this last bullet, hashtag vax up, we are telling you, vax up, that's the call to action. It's presented as a hashtag, so we know it's probably appearing on social. It makes sense because it's not saying get vaccinated, it's saying vax up, mask up. You know, that is part of the way that our community talks to each other. So it's a cultural marker in and of itself. Got it? All right. So let's look at some application. Are we ready? I'm going to go over really quickly a couple of platform pieces just so that you can be mindful of how you want to structure your social media posts. And then we're going to look more specifically at examples, and I want you to be able to start to identify those key pieces that we talked about just now. All right. So just a general overview. You know about the Twitters and the IGs and the YouTubes and the TikToks, right? So when it comes to Twitter, this is really your opportunity to focus on storytelling through language and text, okay? So I want you to think about your trending hashtags. I want you to think about the fact that when you have a specific on Twitter, so it's okay to be slightly controversial and conversational. With IG, we know that the whole pull is around imagery, but I do want you to keep in mind that this day and age, because IG is chasing TikTok, reels in video are going to be really primary in terms of searchability and engagement. So you want to incorporate those things as much as possible. The same is true, of course, for YouTube. And just remember that when it comes to either doing an IG live or showing up on TikTok, and especially through YouTube, which is actually more searched than Google, I think it's the top platform used for searching content. So please understand the value of YouTube. But when you show up in person, this is your opportunity to establish credibility at a level that you cannot do with words alone. And so it's really important that if you're looking to build trust with an audience, show up on video. That's the way to do it. Oh, and not listed here, because I don't need to tell any of you here in the room, Facebook is still king. I know that people think it's being outshined by these other new platforms, but when it comes to the numbers, Facebook still reigns. So just don't neglect the oldie but the goodie. All right, now when you're crafting your social media posts, I want you to remember to use all of the elements that you are familiar with, and just know that the platforms that prioritize certain formats, they still are looking for you to use all of these elements as you're creating your post. So that means that you are going to create a link, or you're going to add a link to everything you can. You can't just be like, oh, I posted this picture, that's good enough. No, I want you to put in a link, because this is where you drive people to credible information. This is where you direct them to get more of the content that they need to move them through that vaccination journey, okay? This is also a great place to put in a call to action to go learn more. You also want to think about the text. This is where you can, again, focus on SEO, which is your search engine optimization. Those keywords, make sure you get those into the text that you're drafting for your captions. And this is also that place, again, to use those cultural markers that we talked about, that in-group language, those colloquialisms, right? All right. Of course, audio, you can use trending songs that as a cultural marker. That's really important. Hashtags, those are really helpful to helping the algorithm find you. So don't neglect the hashtag and the use of hashtags. We already talked about video and video bombs. So you want to make sure that in as much as possible, you can be using videos and images, but you can't forget to attach really strong captions to all of those things. And then let me just also say that when you're thinking about video, this is also your time to include your subject matter experts, okay? Because again, those are the opportunities for building credibility. All right, and then just for, to make sure that you are maximizing your impact and your reach, I want you to be thinking about volume, variety, sometimes just luck. It's like when you have a kid and you want them to be an athlete, so you're like, okay, I'm gonna give them this soccer ball. We're gonna be playing soccer every weekend, all through the week, and it's soccer, soccer, soccer all day. And then you realize, okay, if I want you to be a great athlete, I'm gonna have to throw in some other options for you. Let's build you up. Let's get you in basketball. Let's get you in football. But at the end of the day, you kind of don't know what's gonna resonate with the child. And it can sometimes just be sheer luck. So when you approach social media, I want you to have that same attitude that you do with your kid, right? I want you to post, think about volume, get a lot of content out there. Make sure that there's a lot of variety in your content, but just know you can't quite know what's going to resonate, what's going to pop off as like, viral. You don't ever know what's going to necessarily go viral, what's going to really resonate. So just understand that those three things together will give you the most success. All right. We are running out of time, but I am going to keep it moving. All right. So when you're creating your messages for social media, let's talk. We've already talked about all the different vaccine hesitancy narratives that you could be addressing. And I want you to have those top of mind. I won't go over them again, but just know that in your toolkit, you're going to get not only a counter narrative that addresses those barriers, but it's going to give you the contextual insights so that you can understand the rationale for using those particular narratives. And then if you look at the bottom row here, I just want to point out that your toolkit will also have an opener, some suggested openers for you, like do the math, whatever. It'll have some suggested cultural markers, some of which we already talked about. And then it'll even give you some suggestions for some trusted messengers. So everything you need to get started is going to be in the toolkit. I'm going to show you now an example. And I am going to let this video play. And as it plays, I'm going to want you to think through some of the things that we talked about. I'm going to call them out to you. When you hear the hook, when you hear the key messages, when you hear some of the cultural markers, and let's look just at the caption real quick together. Tired of guessing what's true and false about COVID-19 vaccine? Comedian Kev Stage joined the Black Coalition Against COVID to help address common myths that were started about COVID-19. So we already know that Kev Stage is our spokesperson in this case. He's already offering up that cultural credibility. He is a cultural marker. And then it starts off with that question, which is a really great opener. So let's listen in and see how everything is positioned.
False. False, guys. Just false.
So you see here, we're establishing credibility by explaining
What's
about
craziest
the Black
COVID-19
Coalition.
rumor you've ever heard? The craziest rumor I've ever heard was that this was made in a lab for Black people to die only, and they've been preparing for it to give to Black people and not give the vaccine to Black people.
So establishing common
True or
ground.
false? If you've already had COVID-19, you don't need to get the vaccine. False. The vaccine prepares your body for the virus. and
Boom,
helps
there's the
you to
fact.
Prevent getting seriously ill or dying as a result. But because there are various variants out in the world, getting the vaccine doesn't prevent you from having another viral attack. True or false, Coach?
Okay, I'm gonna stop it right there just for the sake of time because there's some other examples that I want to show you.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me.
Please.
Didn't want to interrupt, but there's one important point I do want to make here, and that's that because Kev on Stage is a comedian, which is part of the reason we use humor, he's able to kind of attack something in ways that, let's say, a community health worker might not, or a peer, or someone who may not be as close. How would I say? The best way to say this would be comedians are able to deliver heavy topics with that and make them less heavy, right? But really, when we're talking in conversation, we may not want to launch in so aggressively in terms of what's the craziest thing I've heard, right? That's why we have to acknowledge that their doubts are reasonable. But in this instance, we can use Kev on Stage to do what we'd like to do.
Right, to just be like false, 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 false. Right, you don't want to do that to folks unless you have that kind of credibility. All right. So then let's do a practice run together. Take a look at this particular post that was put out probably last year. And it says, and it's geared toward parents, and it says the vaccine's already required in schools. And then it lists, of course, MMR, whooping cough, tetanus, the stuff we're all familiar with. I want you to think about the vaccine hesitancy narratives that we talked about earlier. And if you don't mind pulling up the poll in just a second there, but I want to ask you all, can you identify which, let me put it off to the side here, which one of these vax narratives are being addressed here? Which vax hesitancy narratives are being addressed? You can see the caption says, here's a list of vaccines that are already required in schools. Many of us have had this vaccine passport since kindergarten. Adding COVID-19 to this list only provides a safer environment for our youth. So which narratives do you think this one is addressing? I want to make sure you guys are keen on how to know which ones we're addressing. Is it's not worth the risk, vaccines are not safe, COVID vaccines are unnecessary, there's a low perceived threat, and it could be more than one, so it's okay for you to select more than one. I just don't know, there's a lack of clarity, waiting for more information, it's about freedom from government control. Which one do we think we're addressing? When some answers come in, we can flip and show the results. Okay, let's show the results. Awesome. I think you guys have got it. I think we're addressing the idea that you're saying it's not worth the risk, but we are saying, listen, you guys, we take vaccines already, right? You could be saying that this could be addressing the fact that COVID vaccines are not necessary, but we know that directly we say here in the caption, this is going to provide a safer environment for our kids. And then for those who are thinking, of course, this is about freedom from government control. Well, we are already very submissive and very amiable to the idea that vaccines are probably a good idea. We've been doing it all since kindergarten. So thank you so much for that bit of participation. Good job, guys. All right, I want to show you another video that we've been using through these campaigns. And as you're listening to Dr. Darian in this particular video, I want you to listen specifically for the topics that he's addressing. Because when you get your toolkit, you're going to have these listed out for you. So I want you to listen to how we have created this message, made sure we address very particular topics. And I want you to also listen for the engagement strategies that he employs. All right?
I'm back. I've seen a lot of content on here about science from people who have never sat down and studied it, so I thought it would be helpful to come on here and clear some stuff up. I'm Dr. Darian Sutton. I'm a board-certified emergency medicine physician, and I'm here to clear up some
There's the
basic
traditional
concepts
credibility.
that often get confused. Number one, you are completely correct. It is 100% your decision whether or not you get vaccinated, but if you choose not to get vaccinated, you can't expect the same level of access to the community as someone who is vaccinated. Mandates don't force you to get vaccinated, they force you to make a decision. And if you choose not to get vaccinated, your access to public spaces and workplaces changes because you are at a higher risk of getting a COVID-19 infection. And many will reply, well, COVID-19 vaccines don't prevent COVID-19 disease, and that is false. With the latest information that we have from the CDC in the setting of the more transmissible Delta variant, COVID-19 vaccines still prevent and reduce your risk of symptomatic disease by more than 5 times and reduce your risk of hospitalization by more than 25 times. We also have data that shows that those who get vaccinated and still unfortunately get infected with COVID-19 have been shown to have lower viral loads and to clear their viral infections in a shorter amount of time than those who are unvaccinated. Vaccines aren't 100%, no vaccine is, but they still significantly reduce your risk of getting infected. Think of vaccines like raincoats. You'd probably put one on if you knew it was going to rain outside with the understanding that it was going to protect you from heavy rain, but you still might get wet. The argument that vaccines aren't 100%, therefore I will not get one, just doesn't really make sense. For example, a bulletproof vest may not protect you from every bullet, but if you knew there was a high chance of getting shot, you'd probably still put one on. If you're
Looks like Dr. Darren had the toolkit, eh? Right? So, but you can see that he gave all the specific stats and data that we needed to communicate. He also made sure he wrapped him up in some great engagement strategies. So he had some analogy. He framed the very difficult ideas in ways that people are more likely to embrace. Let's keep going.
I'm back.
Okay, last time we were together, for those of you who were here, we did watch some of this video. So I'm gonna ask for some audience participation. For those of you who weren't with us last time, you are gonna get a recording of last month's training. But in the chat, what I want to do is I want to play this video for you again, and I want you to listen in for the barriers and the narratives that you're hearing. I want you to listen in for the facts and those COVID topics, that general message we're trying to communicate. I want you to look and listen for cultural markers. If you hear a hook, I want you to be mindful of that. And when you hear the call to action, I want you to be able to identify that. On the screen, when you hear those things, I want you to drop a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 when you hear them, just so that we can know that you're all tracking with the video and are able to see how we are actually executing on this strategic approach.
We've all heard rumors about the COVID vaccine. It causes erectile dysfunction. It'll make you infertile. It causes pregnancy complications. Easy to understand why you have doubts. So let's talk about it. Unfortunately, forced sterilization was a grim reality for women of color in the US. But numerous laws and ethical guidelines are now in place to protect women of color, so this never happens again. Multiple studies show that COVID-19 vaccination does not affect fertility in either partner.
So you guys are hearing
for
those
couples trying
facts?
to conceive. During trials, there were no differences in the number of conceptions or miscarriages between vaccinated and unvaccinated control groups. There is no evidence that the vaccine causes swollen testicles or impotence, no matter what Nikki says. However, studies do show
There you go,
getting
you hear
COVID
that cultural
may reduce
marker?
sperm count and increase the risk of erectile dysfunction, reducing the chance of having kids. So, what about pregnancy? There's no link between the vaccine and pregnancy complications. There is, however,
Keep dropping your
a higher
numbers.
risk of severe illness from COVID, and the risk for preterm births is as high as 60%. This risk is disproportionately higher in Black and Hispanic women. With so much misinformation around, it's important to calculate the risk and make choices based on the best evidence available.
And I'm waiting for it. There you go. There's that call to action. Excellent. So this gives me the confidence to know that you guys are going to be able to really implement what you get in your toolkit. Let's keep moving. I know we're almost at the end here. All right, so I'm gonna have you watch one more video and then I'm gonna do a little quiz, all right? So in this video, you're gonna be listening for all the cultural markers that Dr. Darian talks about, all right? Here we go.
Hey everyone, Dr. Darian here, emergency medicine physician, and welcome to my pre-shift card chat. Today's topic is booster shots, and I just wanted to use some analogies in how I think of my own immune system, and hopefully it will help you understand how yours works. When I get vaccinated against COVID-19, I'm essentially showing my body a blueprint or a roadmap or instructions of how to identify and eliminate the COVID-19 virus, which has caused more than 4.5 million deaths on this planet. Now, I've already shared a basic understanding of how mRNA vaccines work. I shared it on Instagram. If you scroll down, you can find the video. It's 1 minute and it helps you to understand how the mRNA vaccine triggers your immune system to protect you. But let's quickly talk about what happens in the body after vaccination. So in my bloodstream, I have white blood cells that are constantly meandering around, just looking for a possible threat. To give you a physical picture of what the white blood cell looks like, this is a white blood cell on a smear of blood. If you can see, it is stained or dyed to have a better image, and it is surrounded by red blood cell. The white blood cells do a good job of identifying the threat, but they're not really equipped to fully eliminate it. I think of my white blood cells as blank man. Some of you may know this 1990s reference and some of you may not. I'm sorry. Basically, he really wants to do a good job, but he's just not simply equipped to handle the problem. After vaccination, my white blood cell identifies that protein as a foreign body and captures it and presents it to my more highly trained specific immune response, and that is my B cells and my T cells, in order to eliminate any viral threat and also prepare for any future viral threat. Think of my B cells and my T cells as Wakandan soldiers. They are highly trained and equipped to take down viral threats. B cells originate from my bone marrow, and their job is to identify the threat and to help produce neutralized.
All right, for the sake of time, I'm gonna stop it right there. Let's do a quick poll. Can you guys identify the cultural markers that were present in this video? So I'm going to go ahead and read through them just to get everyone on the same page. Use of the in-car recorded conversation, a culturally congruent doctor, mention of the Black Panther's Dora Milaje, blank man analogy, or all of the above. Yay, hopefully you chose all of the above. We don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to skip through this poll and congratulate you all because I'm sure you got the answer right. During this video, this very culturally congruent doctor sat in his car, right, which is a very common way to approach a video. It's not very highly produced. It feels really natural. He, of course, he compares his white blood cells to blank man, and if you are a kid of the 90s like me, you already know Damon Wayans did his thing in that movie, and it kind of sticks out as this, wayward superhero. But we all know that the real beast are those B cells and those T cells, which is the Dora Milaje in our beloved Black Panther. So I want you to all be in the habit of being able to identify the topics that you want to communicate, the cultural markers that you're going to infuse in your social media posts, and then thinking about how to be sure that you're addressing those targeted narratives that may serve as barriers to folks making decisions toward vaccinations. Now, all of this information is going to be in your toolkit, which I will allow Gail the last few moments to talk through with you all.
Thank you, LaTroya. So hope everybody enjoyed that demonstration of content. As I mentioned in the chat, TikTok is your very good friend when it comes to finding content such as that to repurpose for your campaign. So let's talk about this toolkit. Audience profile. So as I mentioned, we have profiles of both gatekeeping women and moms, as well as parents and caregivers, different information in each of those. Maybe a little bit that overlaps. You'll get the messaging map that helps you to connect the barrier that you're probably most likely to be presented with the cultural narrative that's associated with it, with the counter narrative strategy that you should use to create the content, as well as the core message that you should use to address that original barrier and narrative. And then finally, we'll provide you with the counter narrative key based on the strategy that gives you all kind of little details to make it more culturally relevant to your specific audience. And of course, please feel free to bring in your own cultural markers and the like. And then lastly, we'll provide you with messaging templates so that you can create your own calculated risk content in your own style and own voice. We'll also supply you with existing content. And if that's not enough, there's an entire page on Alive and in Color called the COVID Project. That's actually the project that helped to develop, that we worked on, that helped to develop the counter narrative approach to messaging. That's got even more content. So you should not be at a loss of content. And then finally, we didn't have enough time to do what we wanted to do, which was also talk about scripts for PSAs, but we'll provide you with some instructions and a template for PSA script development as well. All right. So if anyone wants to stay and ask a few questions, I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. If anyone has any questions, you can follow up later after the fact. If you're in the shower tomorrow and have a question, shoot us an email. We'll be happy to respond to that as well. Okay. Well, I hope the lack of questions is a good thing, meaning that most of it made sense and landed in a pretty good place. But again, if not, we take all types of feedback as long as it's respectful. So constructive is welcome as well. Let us know what we might be able to do better next time, what was missing from your standpoint, or just that you thought it was a great webinar. All right, Brittany, is there anything that you'd like to do to close out? Or, oh, we got some things coming in. Oh, thank you, Sandra. We appreciate that. Any other comments or questions, concerns? All right, well, stay tuned. We will be sending you that toolkit, not today, but you will get it soon. You will get it soon, and it'll give you another chance to engage with us on that question that you remembered tomorrow in the shower. All right.
Thank you everyone for joining and have a great day.